I have about 14 pages of notes. I've been told I can speak for about 15 minutes. So I'll get to it. Parts I will read, and parts I will just tell you about experience in the building. First and foremost, welcome. I don't know where most of you have come from, but welcome to California State Legislature and to the Capitol in California. I hope you all get a chance to take a quick tour and become a little more familiar with what the last 170 to 180 years have been about in California. I say that because it's important to maintain the perspective of how young we are as a state. For all the might, the resources, the financial benefits and strengths that we have at our disposal, we are also a relatively young state competing in the world, amongst the world giant economies, placing at 5th. But with that comes quite a bit of work that still needs to be done in order to strengthen our existing infrastructure. When you're talking about, for example, pipelines and places of sensitivity, just in California alone, if my records show me correctly, we have roughly about just under 30,000 miles of pipe infrastructure laid out over the course of the last century. And not most of it has been upgraded. And we're seeing the pipe rope trains in LA with the water system. You can just imagine if there are areas with inflexibility, especially at fault lines, what those gas pipelines are going to do during a time of a major catastrophic level of earthquake. So my interest in this area, I didn't come here to work on earthquake-related issues. I came here, I was elected 7 years ago to come up and work on what I call it as sustainability for Los Angeles. When you look at an area, especially the San Fernando Valley, give you a little bit of context. Look at the San Fernando Valley and how it's grown just in the last 80 years. San Fernando Valley was seen as a ranch. It's kind of like the backyard for the entertainment industry folks who can go out and play and have fun and spend their time not when they're not working. So you'd work in LA proper, work in the metro area, take Cahuenga Pass, go through the hills, and land in the valley, 10 degrees, a little warmer, and all just spread out flat lands that you can enjoy in the orchards or the vegetation or whatever else that your interest took you in. Well, that was up until about the 1920s. Census has 1925 numbers at about 20,000 in San Fernando Valley, 24,000 to be exact. We now boast about 1.8 million in population. Mind you, the water infrastructure hasn't changed much. It's increased over time, but some of the main trunk lines are as old as when they were first installed there by Mulholland. So, Bob Mulholland. So that right there kind of gives you this prism of the need we have and the challenges we have as we've grown, but we haven't really addressed some of the critical infrastructure investments that we've needed to invest in. So when I came up here, I wanted to work on transportation and water. Water for the purposes of never finding ourselves as LA beholden to water interests and brokers up here who would dictate the terms and the finances of what we would have to pay in the future. So long as we strengthen our water infrastructure, we won't be beholden to anyone. It's just looking at things from a position of strength. Transportation, because as LA has grown, and as what I told you about going from 20,000 residents to 1.8 million residents in a relatively short period of time, 80 years time, there is no room for a movement in the valley, and it's only going to get worse. And the fact that we had a transportation system and we took it apart, now we're looking at putting it back at a much more premium cost, this is an engineering forum, so I should have started by saying, when I start talking, logic stops, and because politics starts. Unfortunately, that's what happened. Those were decisions that were made. California was sold on the idea of driving with your top down along PCH. It drove people out to California who didn't want to be in a sunny state. And so the car industry, auto industry, along with the oil and various manufacturing industries, manufacturing the components of autos, notably the tire industry, started making their appropriate investments so that they strengthen their industries in the state. And they've done pretty well. So as I started looking at infrastructure, as I started looking at also housing, it just became all the more critical and prevalent that when all of these areas are extremely interrelated, if we want to make a dent in one, we're not going to be successful if we don't make parallel dents in other areas. You can't address the housing situation and the crisis that we have, especially in Los Angeles right now or in San Francisco, without an appropriate and complementary transportation system. A lot of our housing issues would have been dealt with had we made appropriate transportation investments. Had the high-speed rail been in place right now, we wouldn't have seen some of the housing challenges, pressure points that we're seeing right now. So, without getting further down that rabbit hole, moving to how earthquakes and natural disasters impact us. If it wasn't, if we are gonna maintain a certain standard of living, and if we're gonna want to be able to compete at the continuous level of where we've been as fifth in the world economy, if we don't make the appropriate investments now, whether in functional recovery or any other of the whole host of preventative steps that we can take, we're going to be falling behind very quickly. And it's not going to be difficult to see that most of those jobs will flee our state as quickly as they got here, or even quicker, unfortunately. And this was evidenced also by an article that I love to refer to in LA Times from last May of 2018, where drills are taking place in Arizona to be able to, emergency drills are taking shape in Arizona to prepare themselves for the onslaught of 400,000 California refugees. And what I loved was the California refugees portion. That wasn't a word that I gave, that's the word that was written in the article, used in the article. Moving from California to Arizona because of the mass dispersion that we're going to be facing after a major catastrophic level earthquake. So, having lived in the San Fernando Valley for a long time, having witnessed the 94 earthquake, and by the way, if you go through a major earthquake like the one in 94 Northridge, that especially was very different than anything else. And you all can talk to me about that at much greater length and detail of how it was different, but having experienced it, also, it was nothing like I had experienced before. And given the 220 different active seismic fault lines that we have in our state, especially along the coastal areas, it's just a matter of time until we have another such major incident. And this Ridgecrest event was actually a good wake-up call. It's unfortunate how a disaster itself gets us better prepared to want to focus on it. So when I got here, I started trying to look at how I'm going to be addressing seismic-related issues. There's what you do before the event, there's what you do during the event, and then there's what you do after the event. I'm not an engineer, but I like to have things done in an algorithm and in a if-what scenario so that it makes my mind at least work more comfortably so that I know the things that I need to put into place have been either addressed or need to be addressed. And most of it falls into the pre-section because we've dealt in California enough with natural occurring disasters to be able to effectively address issues. Even though the challenges may outweigh our human capability, we are still able to address them. But there's a cost to that. Human cost, machine cost, environmental cost, and displacement and everything else that we've seen. So, and then of course the after segment has all the things that we look at for mitigation, recovery, reinvestment programs. But in the pre-section, what I started looking at is how prepared are we to be able to deal with a certain situation. So everything from a basic human level, our CERT programs, our individual emergency preparedness plans and programs at various level communities. That was one. Two, early warning system. Are we making the appropriate investments in the early warning system so that we can be able to at least give ourselves the luxury of time, however long it may be, so that we are able to address the most sensitive mechanical operations or just operations taking place, whether from hospitals to major infrastructure building circumstances, so that we can avoid human loss. Third, do we even have a sense of what our need is? Local jurisdictions started making the investment with LA, San Francisco, and about a dozen others of figuring out what is it that we're dealing with when we have a major catastrophic event. But the entire state is not at all prepared. So we have these disparate portions of information coming in from different places, not all very well coordinated, because they're all doing it individually based on their own parameters that they come up with. And so it was important to have a statewide plan that would set the parameters and know exactly what we're dealing with. When someone goes into the hospital and is diagnosed with something, before going to the surgery table, they want to know exactly what they're going to be operated on, not just having a random organ being taken out and then figuring out that that was the wrong organ. Let's go back to the surgery table again and get the right organ out. So there's a precision that's necessary, and that's why this inventory list will be the start of helping us get to what is it that we need to address, and then prioritize it based on how old it is, how out of compliance it is with current standards, versus the level of seismicity in the area that the buildings are located in. The other would be looking at upgrading our codes, which is something that this whole conversation today is about, functional recovery, which was an idea that was introduced to me by many of you here, and notably by Dr. Lucy Jones when we started working together about 4 years ago. I do very much appreciate CEOC and SRI and EERI's involvement with all of my work over the course of the last few years. And then providing support for all of this would be the financial mechanisms. Whether I had a bill that set up a $10 million revolving fund through the California Treasurer's Office, CalCap program, that would allow major building owners to utilize the money, take it out at a low interest, conduct their work, reinvest back with that interest so that the fund is continuously used by different borrowers over time, and it marginally increases over time given the interest rate that they're paying back. And as the need grows for that, we're going to be making supplemental investments from the state as well. to looking at tax credits. I had a tax credit bill that was vetoed by the governor a few years ago, and I brought it back again this year, and it was held in appropriations because we weren't certain exactly about how much of an investment that needed to be made. That's going to be something that I'm going to have a continuous dialogue with the governor to bring it back again and make the appropriate investments, because we need to offer relief to our business owners, homeowners, and property owners, so that they know, A, that there's support if they need it, and they can receive the funds necessary and pay back as they move forward after the investments are made. And while those investments are made, they start receiving benefits, whether it's in the form of seeing less of a premium from insurance companies or other long-term benefits that financially come their way. Down to programs like Brace and Bolt. California started the Brace and Bolt program after the '94 earthquake. Because one of the things that we saw was individual homes that were built prior to standards of the late '70s were very easily crumbling with just a minor level of movement. But anywhere between a $3,000 to $5,000 investment of ensuring that the house is braced to the foundation of the building will overcome significant costs. With that $3,000 to $5,000, you're able to save $300,000 to $500,000 potentially in home repair and home loss, which then goes to the insurance component to it. California Earthquake Authority is capitalized at maybe roughly about $7 to $8 billion at this point. Our reinsurance is increasing over the course, it's somewhere around $300 million a year now. And it's going to be increasing steadily as more and more people start buying into the insurance, especially given our high housing prices right now. As the housing prices go up and it overcomes the premium becomes, the deductible becomes less than the equity you own in the house, more and more people are going to buy it. Just in the last 2 years, we've seen a bump of at least about 4% points in homeowners purchasing earthquake insurance. So if that's going to keep on growing, our reinsurance costs are going to go to a level where we're just going to, as a state, going to be paying whatever capital we receive over to purchasing reinsurance. So I had a bill on looking at reconfiguring that a little bit, but that was more challenging. We were only able to save about $30 million in reinsurance costs, and we're going to have continuous conversations about how we can address that issue as well. So, having gone over a little bit about what I've done and how it relates to a large metropolitan area like Los Angeles and the greater LA area, wanted to talk a little bit about how we move forward. I've worked with many of you here on to move forward versions of AB 1857, which was the functional recovery, and AB 2681, which was the inventory bill. This year in the forms of AB 393, and which was similar to 1857, and AB 429, which is going to be working with the Seismic Safety Commission to create a survey of potentially seismically vulnerable buildings in high seismic risk zones throughout the state. While some cities have started identifying vulnerable buildings and implemented mandatory retrofits, we still have a way to go. Understanding the scope of our seismic vulnerabilities and getting that information to the Department of Finance will help build a case to get more money for mitigation programs. While earthquake resilience is an important and necessary goal, it's critical to understand the legislative process and to keep a few things in mind. First, we can't make perfection the enemy of good. We tend to do this a lot. And especially speaking to a group of scientists, that's why I introduced by saying, all logic stops now when you're in this building, and other things come into consideration. Science and engineering may be black and white, but policy has gradations. In an ideal scenario, we would get all the money and latitude necessary to implement the legislation I've been discussing. Unfortunately, given the constraints of the state budget and competing policy priorities, compromises have to be made in order to diffuse opposition, both from stakeholders and the administration, to move these bills and policy agendas forward. Second, don't underestimate how much something may cost. I've been told on a few occasions to just focus on getting grant money to locals to assist their retrofit efforts. Grant programs are great, but they also require administrative funding, which can significantly cut into the impact of a relatively small amount, like $3 million can have. Just as an example, I've been working on a children's savings, something totally different and outside of engineering and seismic safety related issues. I've been working on children's savings account. Given where we are with education debt topping over $3 trillion in overall national student debt, another way of looking at it, because the state can't afford to pay all of these costs to help support its future workforce, what we can do is make incremental investment today for every child born in California, so that over the next 18-year period, these small investments coupled with other investments, whether from the family, whether from grants received by philanthropic organizations or local jurisdictions, coupled with how the market performs over the course of the 18 years until that child is ready to go to college or pursue some academic career, they will have enough money in the pot to be able to afford at least 1 year of college, depending on where price indexes are in the future. So that was something I started working on about 4 years ago. The first year when we introduced the bill, we were able to get only $3 million funding. This year, the governor put $50 million into the program because he also happens to like the idea. But the initial work led to us to also be able to have the successes we did this year. So sometimes some things that are new start incrementally, and there's two things to remember. They start incrementally, and it doesn't mean that we can't have future successes. We just need to make sure that the current placeholder that we have in place is successful so that it ensures future successes. Second, sometimes the investment can be so small that just the administration side of it sucks up the whole dollar funding and doesn't allow for the programs to be taken advantage of. So the $3 million, if we were very quick at spending it and building the big infrastructure, we would have had no programs, local jurisdictions benefiting from those dollars. So we needed to be very quick at making sure that dollars were being rolled out to local jurisdictions who were craving to establish a program for their youth to college programs, so that we can start the program going. Third, just because a bill doesn't make it the first time doesn't mean the issue is laid to rest. In fact, this is the place where dead bills, the zombie bills as it's referred to come back over and over and over again. Many times we use legislation to push policy discussions. This results in some big important issues taking years to be refined and signed into law. This was the case with green building standards. I can speak to this because formerly as a chief of staff to a member who was very much interested in clean and green technology, he had introduced AB 62. And this is my former boss, Paul Krikorian, who's now a councilman in Los Angeles. He was only here for 3 years, a term and a half. And this was such a big issue area, and not a lot had been done already, that we were looking at making strides and big changes in what parameters we set forward. So we looked at, now it looks very humble, but in 2006, it was actually a pretty big step. It was looking at making year 2020 be the, I think it was 2020, 33% RPS, renewable energy portfolio. And in that discussion came a lot of issues of battery life, storage, transmission, environmental issues. All of these things that we're still grappling with today came up. But what happened was the issue became so important given our environmental needs and some of the existential needs we have with climate change. At the same time, it was such a easily viewable, parameter-based area that we could target and set standards and hit those goals, that even after my boss left and moved to city council, that issue continued playing forward, and now we have RPS standards being a full 100% by the year 2050. 2050 is pretty far away, and we'll probably hit that goal before then. But it tells you where some things with small starts, in fact that year, that bill, AB 62, was vetoed because Governor Schwarzenegger at the time didn't like some of the language in it. And a year after, when we were gone and Schwarzenegger was gone as well, the very same bill with very slight modification actually went into effect, and Jerry Brown signed it into law. So sometimes the work and the benchmark that you start allows for greater dialogue and conversation and individuals' imagination of where something can go and what we need to be striving for. So it's very important to keep these things in mind as we're working towards these policies. I look forward to continuing our work together on AB 393 and 429 to advance through the legislative process. Both bills are currently in Senate Appropriations suspense file, and we'll know their fate on Thursday, August 29. My hope is that the work we've done in the past year and a half will enable both measures to be heard on the Senate floor and reaches the governor for his signature. With that, I don't think we're asking any questions, or I don't know if there's question and answers. I'm happy to stick around and answer some questions. And once again, I very much thank you for hosting this event, bringing this very important issue at the forefront. And when some of you, I don't know how many of you live in LA, or if you don't live in LA, you can always pick up a copy of LA Times. Very appropriately, today there are 2 articles on the front page of the California section. One talking about 80,000 aftershocks after the Ridgecrest earthquake, and the other talking about environmental impacts on the pupfish during the quake. And what's not printed in the paper version, but is online, is the discussing the monster that is the San Andreas Fault, 730-mile stretch. So there's quite a bit of public awareness stirring in this front. And what's important is that as scientists, as engineers, we also continue strengthening that conversation forward with facts, and in a public display, not start picking apart the minutia of where we want to be, but instead focusing on where we want to be and ensuring that we get there, because these conversations, when they get lost, it makes sense amongst the group of folks who dedicate their lives to it. But in a public arena, in a public setting, you only have 15 seconds to make an impression and move forward. Use those 15 seconds very wisely, and let's make sure that we capture, while this is a hot topic, we capture the imagination of individuals and the awareness and understanding, and move the issues forward so that we can create a more resilient California. Again, thank you for NIST and the folks from the federal government's agencies being here. I look forward to working with you. Thank you.